So, yeah, WHYJATS4R, talking about that. So, initially, the question is, why did we need it? Most of you were probably here last year, and there was a big call on the community to do something about trying to standardise the WHYJATS XML. And so that's what we did. We formed WHYJATS4R. I'll talk a little bit more about how it's formed and everything. But I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the different use cases and why people think it's important. So starting up, we've got Mike Minarak from Highwire Press, and he's enthusiastic about the efforts to represent the common data structures and principles ways while considering the needs of consuming channels that have different requirements and purposes. Now that's the only real quote which he gave me. The others I made up, but they're all in the room. So Daniel, he wants to be able to easily harvest WHYJATS XML from open access content. Jeff wants greater standardization of content that arrives at PMC. And myself and Tom, we're in journal production, and we want greater standardization across publishers and creators of WHYJATS XML, so we can globally reduce production costs. Now that's quite a grandiose statement, and it's something that in an ideal world, that's what we want, but we're just kind of starting small. And I didn't put this on here, it got bumped off when Mike agreed to give me a quote, is that from my point of view, I think it's really important that journal production staff have got a better understanding of XML and WHYJATS XML. And so a lot of the stuff that we're doing, I'm constantly pulling back, because I've got all these really brainy XML complete geeks around me, and pulling it back saying, yeah, but we've got to make sure this is understandable for production staff. So that, because that's where the key area is, as in they've got to understand it. They've got to stop thinking about PDFs. I know we all agree on this. It's like the idea that the XML is the canonical source and that the PDF is just one representation of it, and that we've got to change the way people think. But anyway, so the way we've got things now, we've got a bunch of publishers. We've got a bunch of publishers that may use vendors, may use one or two vendors, or may just produce their XML themselves. And we have a whole bunch of different flavors and versions and whatever, this big kind of mishmash of XML. And then that goes out to a bunch of hosts. They may self-host. You've got a bunch of repositories. You've got same publishers may be giving to the same host, different ones, hosts passing on to repositories, but it's all kind of this big mishmashy thing. And that in the corner, that's Daniel's bot that is trying to harvest information from there, and he's not happy. So this is what we really want to do, is we want everyone to have WHYJATS4R compliant XML, and then it can go anywhere, and it can go to anyone and be recycled all around the place, and we've got happy bots. And I mean, really, the idea as well that it's completely reusable in the sense for publishers as well is it becomes much more cheap, like it's much more manageable. So everything conforms. You can go to your vendor and say, oh, we're using WHYJATS4R, so when we transition to you, we expect reduced prices. I mean, that's maybe sound a bit crazy, but we might get there, you know. And when journals change publishers, if it's all in the same format, it's all kind of really crystal clear, then it should help. But I know that's a long way off, and I am slightly idealistic about all these things. But anyway, to get back to WHYJATS4R, so the history, there was a call for action at this conference last year, and in June we had a kick-off meeting, and a group was formed. The kick-off meeting, we were really lucky that Jeff and Debbie were already in the UK, so for another meeting, and they came over, and the same with Daniel Meacham. And we had a bunch of UK-based open access publishers there. The reason that we started out with the open access publishers was because Daniel was the one who was really pushing about the license statements and standardizing that. And so, in a way, if it wasn't open access, he kind of didn't really care, and it was just making standard open access content available to him. So that's why we started off that way. But it is completely open to everyone now, and we want as many people to join as possible. We had our first public appearance when we had a Google Hangout in Open Access Week, And in January, we recruited a bunch more collaborators, so I put out a call to kind of fellow production/technology people in UK publishers, and so we've got a few more people that have joined. And just last week, we made our first formal recommendations and released the validation tool, which you'll see later from Jeff. So that's kind of pretty exciting within that year to have achieved all of that lot. And we have a workflow where we've got the prioritization list. So the initial kickoff meeting, we came up with a list of things, and license statements and math were at the top. So we started off with them. We have samples loaded into a GitHub repository, and we agree on best practice. The tools are built, we write the documentation, and then we publish the recommendations, and we'll eventually, hopefully, publish compliance stats. That all seems really straightforward, but obviously it's taken us a year to get to 2 points. It's not always that easy to agree on best practices, for instance. There were a lot of toing and froing over various things, and coordinating with everyone can get difficult, but still, we'll keep on ploughing through the list we've got. And also, we'd like to know if there are other things that are important to other people that we need to add to our list. So, starting up, permissions, that was the first thing we tackled. So it's contained in the article metadata section at the front matter. It's split up between machine-readable and human-readable components. So obviously, because it's WHYJATS4R reuse, machine readability will ignore the human-readable bits, and we leave that up to the publisher to put whatever they want in those sections. So we came up with some basic recommendations that, which are not that dissimilar to what WHYJATS is advocating anyway, that if an article is under copyright, it needs to have a copyright year and a copyright holder present. The copyright year should be a 4-digit year with no white space. And the license statement should contain the xlink href, basically the URL should be in there. And this is where we did see a lot of differences, because a lot of people were putting that in the license P section, but because that's not human, because that's human readable as opposed to machine readable, it was a bit pointless there. So another big area for us was the idea of cascading permissions. And so obviously I've got 4 examples in the eLife content so far, and it's all been changed to conform to these new recommendations. But some full open access CC BY content, occasionally you will get authors that are insisting on reusing a figure or something from somewhere else. And so we did need to be able to incorporate the third-party material, and for Daniel's bot to be able to recognize it somehow and not republish it or reuse it. One option was that the whole article has to become all rights reserved, for example, and that wasn't really an option for a lot of us publishers, because it seemed unfair that just because of one figure the whole lot should go. So therefore we introduced cascading permissions. I won't go through it all because you can read it or look at it later, but that is there. So it was a long time. We produced these final recommendations. They got published, and then the NISO accessing license indicator tags came along. That's fine, that's great. And then the WHYJATS recommendations came in last week, where they say that WHYJATS will recommend moving the URL from the license to the ALI license ref. Great, thank you. So I don't think these are our final recommendations on license statements, because they're contrary to what is suggested there. So we will probably have to go back and revisit that, but that's where we are now. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Mr. Math, because there's no way I'm trying to do anything to do with that.
Sorry to leave you on stage by yourself. I'm a little shy for this. It's a problem I've always had, yeah. Is it the down arrow? Or is it the mouse? Let me see. Mouse. There we go. Just really very briefly, there are three ways to save math. One is TeX or LaTeX, more or less interchangeable. TeX has the richest content. You can save almost anything in TeX. MathML is good because it is standard, reusable, and it's an XML extension. And there's a picture, like GIF. It always looks the same. It can't go wrong. But of course, it's just a picture. The full recommendations are on the WHYJATS4R website, so I won't go through all of them. Math comes, it's either inside the paragraph or you're breaking the paragraph to show the math by itself. So the first one is an inline, second one is display. So this is how we recommend inline formula or display formula. So if it's a TeX math, it's inline formula, TeX math, you put the math / TeX math. Notice there are no dollars either side. So because those are redundant, we know that that's math, so we delete the dollars or the backslash, square bracket, round bracket in display math and in inline math. You can have alternatives, up to 3 alternatives. So you can put the TeX math and the MathML and the graphic all together. You can only have one of each, so you can't have 2 GIFs, obviously, because that would be silly. TeX macros or LaTeX macros, LaTeX is great if you're a LaTeX user. You can put lots of macros, so if you're using a huge equation, you can just define it as a \a, and every time you say \a, that equation comes. And it's great. We've said that you can put in custom meta, you can put your math definitions. For example, def RMI is RMI. It's slightly quicker to write. And then so when the system will read that, and MathJax will then use that definition always. This is an example where something that you can do in LaTeX, but you can't do in math. And there are a lot of specific examples of these. For example, there's commutative diagrams, Feynman diagrams, etc., where people are using TeX all the time. There is no way to put that into MathML. And this is an equation. We get equations like this. I have no idea how to read this. Something u minus lambda, but it's in a specific field of mathematics. In this case, we can only use graphic. So I think you can use the TeX, but whether MathJax would read that or not, I don't know. So I guess in this case, we just put a graphic. So general recommendations are, now use a if you're using only graphic, then it should be only when there's no alternative. If it's A plus B equals C, then you should use MathML or TeX, or both of those, and a graphic as well, but don't use a graphic by itself. And extremely important, it's up to whoever's producing this content to ensure that the alternatives are all equivalent. Right? If there's an alpha in one, it should be alpha in the other. What you want to do is to generate all of them automatically from one of them. Personally, I'd say TeX or LaTeX, because LaTeX can do more than the other ones. So you can take a TeX file or LaTeX file and automatically create the MathML and the GIF. That is a problem in publishing, I feel. We have, for example, it's a bigger problem where you have several different versions on one website. What happens if they don't match? But that's a much bigger issue. I think that is my last slide.
All right. Okay, so I get to talk about the plumbing. we knew that we had to version our recommendations. And it looks like we're going to have to version them sooner, as Melissa said, rather than later. I think fortunately we've officially released version 0.1, so that'll be okay. We decided that we're going to version things linearly rather than having version 2 of permissions and version 3 of math. And hopefully this table makes some sense. Every time there's a new recommendation added, the WHYJATS4R version will increase. Now, we'll probably use real computery version numbers with dots and other numbers there, not just 1, 2, 3, but this will give you the idea. So in this example, on January 1st, if we have the first iteration of permissions, that's going to be version 1. And then in March, if we have the first iteration of author tagging, that'll be WHYJATS4R version 2, and so on. So we knew that if we're going to make recommendations, we had to give people a way to test whether their recommendations were, whether they were following the recommendations. And this works with most of the recommendations that we have made. A recommendation like don't use a graphic unless you have to is not something we can say. No, you'd be able to tag that in MathML. We can't read the graphic and tell you that. But we've come up with 3 levels of reporting in our validation tool: errors, warnings, and tagging information. And the idea is that if you have a file that has no errors, it's WHYJATS4R compliant. But there are going to be things that you might want to see as warnings. So if you have a display formula that includes only a graphic, you might want to be warned, oh, don't forget, if you can tag this in MathML or LaTeX, you should do it. So that's a warning. It's not something we can declare as wrong, but that's a warning. The tagging information is really, oh, we've seen that you've done this. You might want to think about these other things, and we have some examples coming up. Really, that would be if you're sitting down to tag an article and you want to see what help you can get. You run it through the validator with information set on, and you'll get some tagging hints. So the validator is written, the master validation files are in schematron format, and they are available in the GitHub repository, because everything's in GitHub. So we've written schematron modules broken down by topic and by reporting level. Hopefully this will make sense. So a reporting level of errors will report only errors. A reporting level of warnings will report warnings and errors, and a reporting level of information will give you the tagging information and any warnings and any errors that you've encountered. So for the current version, which would be the 2 recommendations, we have the following schematron modules: math errors, math warnings, math info, permissions errors, permissions warning, and permissions info. Now you can build all kinds of nice combinations of these. So these are used by different schematron files with phase. So if phase is set to info, you get info and warnings and errors. And there's another schematron master file that will allow you to call things in by topic. So if all you want to do is check your permissions, you can set your phase to permissions, and you'll run the permissions tests. There's another master schematron file which will run all tests, but at the error level only. And since Wendell did it, we'll do it here. So here's our schematron file. The interesting parts are here in red, which is just, this is where we're just calling in the 2 error modules. So, we then thought we needed a way to have articles declare that they were WHYJATS4R compliant. And we came up with we found the XML model processing instruction, which isn't really well supported, but it's an interesting place to hang information like this. And what this does is a processing instruction which you can put at the top of your article, and it says, use this schematron. Now, I believe that the only tool that supports it is Oxygen, and if you use the XML model processing instruction along with a doc type, it will ignore the doc type. Unless you do what? Switch the... Turn what off?
You can have it do both if you like.
Oh, okay. That would be great, because I was complaining that it only did one. So, we've made a public validation tool. This was written by Alf Eaton. It's a Saxon CE application that runs XSL versions of the schematron. And that's on the client side, which is really very cool. And here's a picture of it. It's very simple. You can select the error level that you want reported, select your file, and let it run. Here is one that has run, and you can see this is set to error level, so you're reporting only errors. So somewhere in here we have a MathML element that's not stuck inside of a disk formula or an inline formula. Two of those. And we've got a disk formula that contains more than one expression. Now I think, time for a live demo. So we'll see how this works. This was me before I got my haircut. So we go to the WHYJATS4R site. We go to validation. An online validator is available here. And we're going to run it for errors. Hopefully we'll get the same ones that we've gotten before. I will browse for a file on the desktop. Come on, desktop. Where's the desktop? I did this before y'all got here this morning. Test instance. And we'll let it process, and it should come up right now. So this is running on the client using Saxon CE with XSLs generated from the schematron, and this is showing us the errors that we had seen before. And if you want, we can see, we'll revalidate with warnings. So we can see some warnings. So those are warnings. The one at the bottom is telling us about mathematical expressions should be marked up unless they can't be. In the early days, that rule was much stricter, and we said all mathematical expressions needed to be marked up. So this used to be an error, but we've backed out of that. And I think I can run it again with the tagging information set, which is going to give me all of the reporting levels. So we can see our helpful tagging hints. never ask me this again. So the helpful tagging hints, I think, really are something that would be helpful to somebody who's tagging the article. The content of the copyright statement is intended for display, that is human consumption. Therefore, the contents of this element aren't addressed by these recommendations. And information about what the copyright holder, what the JATS4R group feels that the copyright holder is intended for. So the tool is really very cool. It was written by Alf Eaton on the schematrons that I put together, and then the whole thing was kind of bundled up and made nice and pretty and cleaned up by Chris Maloney. It's a really very cool thing, and he told me today that the tool can actually be taken and used to apply to other schematrons. Is that right, Chris? Sure. Okay, excellent. So that's the end of the live demo. Unless you want me to break something more. I'm not prepared for, oh, we're at the beginning again. Live demo, which worked, and we're on the next priorities. Melissa's going to come back and finish things up. I do want to say that none of this would have happened without Melissa. She drives our group forward, and she's been fantastic.
I say the same about you, too. Okay, so as you can see, the tool, which we think is really cool, is released and is out there now. And we're on to the next priorities. So I've used the COGS image that was free from PowerPoint anyway, but it's like this idea that everything is moving parts, like, for instance, the permissions. We're going to have to change that slightly now. But I've put the URL at the bottom there, which is our prioritization list. Isn't it the tool is the fanciest thing about what we've done. It's a Google spreadsheet where we've people who have we've put a bunch of things that we think need to be dealt with, and people are rating them, and then we address each new priority as it goes along. So the next ones are up versioning and corrections and references. There are current next priorities that we're going to deal with next, but it's all up for grabs. So this is our homepage. Everything is open. Like all the tools and everything is on the GitHub repo. We have our mailing list that you can join. We've got the repositories, a list of open issues, and we are constantly looking for people to add to that. So I know we started out with some open access publishers, but it's really key that everyone gets involved and tells us what they think, so that we don't have to revisit things when new recommendations come out, and also so that there's more buy-in, because then this becomes like more global and more important. So yeah, everything's there. We've got a Google Drive as well. Nothing's under lock and key. We've currently got these people endorsing us. Now, I had to be very clear about what endorsing JATS4R meant. It doesn't mean to say that if you have your name up there, you've got to do everything that JATS4R has recommended like that. But it means that you're willing to try or are involved and want to go with this mission of trying to make everything more open. Yeah, so not more open. Oh, you can tell I'm an open access publisher. More global, like we're all doing the same thing, so that JATS tagged XML can be reused easily. And that's the last slide. See, that's not fair. They've left me here. Okay. I was just topping and tailing. Bruce.
Bruce Rosenblum from Monera. Two questions. First, for Jeff, what versions is the tool compatible with? Blue, green, NLM 1.x, JATS 1.x? Well, what does it work with?
I'm thinking. I don't think I think it would work with any version that you have. Now, when we have to apply these new ALI license, the license indicator elements, it's going to have to decide if you are 1.1D3 or greater, you probably need to use the ALI elements. And if you're a younger XML, you should use the recommendations that we've already written. That's going to get a little more confusing. But I don't think anything we've written so far is dependent on any version of the schemas.
Okay, great, thanks. Second question, Laura, where are you?
I'm back here.
Laura, what, if any, interactions are there between this and this PMC style checker? Which do we need to be making priority for PMC submissions?
We have not made a decision yet, and I will make announcements as necessary.
Thank you.
I did announce last year during the call to action that if the group puts together reasonable recommendations, the content would be allowed in PMC. But that wasn't really out on a limb. Yes, Tommy?
Hi, Tommy Esden, Mulberry Technologies. I really like this activity. I'm very impressed by the way you're going about this. There was only one thing that sort of jumped out at me, and that was that I heard that it is silly to have more than one GIF for more than one graphical representation of a mathematical object. You don't have anybody who does high and low res versions?
Sorry, yes. You put me in my place, yes. Yes, if it's high and, let me see, how did we come up with that recommendation without seeing?
I don't think we did.
Yeah.
Oh, no, we didn't think about that option
Yeah.
of having...
High and low version, that's correct, and it's up. Obviously, you have to make sure that it is correct. We were probably thinking about that. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
if you can't have the two different tech versions,
Okay.
and you can't have two different MathML versions. So it doesn't apply to the GIF. Have I sort of managed to squirm
Okay,
out of
good.
that?
It just,
Okay.
it didn't make
you
any
have to.
sense that you couldn't have two
No.
graphical versions.
No, you're absolutely right. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Evan?
So Evan Owens, Senveo. So you're deprecating PC data mathematics? Is that what's happened here? You're saying it has to be tech or MathML, even though JATS supports PC data?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So
Well, we're not deprecating it because we're not the JATS group.
no, but
We're
that
the
would
group who says,
create an
we think that
error.
things should be best tagged this way.
That would be reported as an error. Is my
Would be
question.
reported as an error in WHYJATS4R.
Okay. Then the other more theoretical question, having written one of the first LaTeX to SGML translations in the industry, we had a lot of discussion about what is a formula, because tech authors often just tag something because they want it in italic, even though it's not a formula. So you're not going anything into the semantic space of what is a formula or what is not a formula.
You're both waiting for me.
Yeah.
You're Mr. Math.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that's a problem we have. We get a file. Sometimes you don't know if it's a formula or not. That's the problem. You know, a mathematician, sometimes mathematicians themselves don't know what it is, but they say, well, you know, we understand each other. We're trying to take what mathematicians, and put it into something that can be reused again. So there's no definitive answer to that.
Yeah, the schematron checks to see if there's a tech math or an MML math element flying around in elements other than disk formula or inline formula. Yes, Debbie.
Debbie LePere, Mulberry Technologies. I am most excited about the fact that you people now have examples. And 2 people have already asked me, are there examples in the tag library yet? I find that interesting. I wasn't sure whether examples would flow from you guys to us or us to you, but there probably ought to be communication in the examples. And I suggest that as an action item for a couple of us.
Well, yeah, no, we're going to strike a bargain with you. That we'll give you some samples and you let us put the logo there. Well, actually, that's up to Jeff. But it's on our
Approved
radar.
by...
Yes, Wendell?
Wendell Pease Consulting Services. So I think this is I think we're all pretty much gaga. This is really great. I'm interested in how you're going to deal with all the problems that come with success. Specifically, I foresee the problems that we always face when we try to promulgate rules. And we try to encourage the promulgation by supporting. It's something I talked about this morning. So, for example, I can easily see a case where somebody who runs the tool fails to see errors in the permissions that you would report, not because the permissions are correct, but because the whole thing was snarled up so that the schematron wasn't even able to match the thing that was being tested for the permissions. Right? So in other words, there are always, the more complex we get and the more complex the requirements we address, there are always these little edge cases that we kind of, hope are not going to pop up. And then when we do, we say, oh, well, that's an edge case, and we patch it, right? Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, our poor innocent client has progress forward 6 months down on the assumption that we were correct and they were wrong when it was our tool that was messed up or incomplete all along, right? So in other words, we have to sort of manage that boundary of expectations. Have you guys thought about that, how to manage that and how to sort of back up the kinds of reports you give by by establishing sort of baseline criteria for what makes a document even testable? That it must be valid, it must, whatever those criteria are?
No, I guess I just assume in the XML world that it must be well-formed and valid against the schema that it references. Chris?
We're working on incorporating a DTD validator also on the client in this. There have been problems with the fact that since this is client side, it uses the browser's parser to parse the XML, but browser parsers don't go out and read the DTD. So if your JATS document has things like character entity references in there.
Even Saxon CE is using the browser parser?
Yes, it uses the browser parser. So it will fail to parse
That's
completely.
How they keep it down to 2 megabytes.
Yeah. So, and that also means it's quirky that some browsers are acting slightly differently than others, not in the parsing, but in the error reporting, if there are parser errors. So, so we actually talked about trying to force or include in the recommendations that the documents be standalone and not require a DTD. That didn't fly. Still think it's a good idea, but so in the meantime, we're working towards trying to, like I say, incorporate a client-side DTD reader and validator. Again, it's Alf Eaton who's done some work on that. So that'll move forward, I think. I'm not sure that answers your question, though, or not.
Oh, well, I mean, it's reassuring in the sense that you're thinking about the larger frame things. I mean, I'll argue with you offline about whether requiring standalone is a good idea or not.
And also, just your point about the edge cases, I'm going to start sounding like Debbie now. I don't want examples, well, I do, but I want people to join us and to, on the open issues, to enter into the discussion. You don't have to you don't have to be part of the mailing list, come to the regular meetings or whatever, but please do get involved because you know your edge cases. And so if we're not aware of them, it's more difficult. So just please do get involved and give us your samples. Okay, I'll quote you direct.
Yes, Kevin.
Kevin Hawkins, University of North Texas Libraries. So the tag guidelines currently include a few statements of best practices, even though they're not validated because it's just a statement of best practices. And so I'm wondering if the group has ambitions to have the JAT Standing Committee include any of these statements of best practices in the JAT specification as well, possibly even offer, along with the DTDs, schematron validation as well for these best practices in the main standard? Or are you looking to, remain a sort of nimble, independent group that's not going to be held up by the process of a standing committee?
You want that one?
No.
Can I try?
I think that WHYJATS4R has to be an independent group. I think that if the WHYJATS4R group has a lot of suggestions about how things can be tagged, it would be great if this group provided examples and possibly even a reference from the tagging guidelines out to, well, here's a group that is making tagging recommendations. I think the JAT Standing Committee would probably want to discuss that before I committed to anything, because I can't. Yes, Tommy.
I'd like to point out, Tommy Heston, you've heard me rattle on before. There are very few best practices documented in the JATS documentation. There are common practices documented in the JATS documentation, and that's because when people asked us to document best practices, they then got some of the same people who asked us to document best practices got very bent out of shape when the documentation of best practices didn't include the way they do it, even if they're the only people who do it that way. So the JATS documentation, which, by the way, is non-normative, and that's important because there's the JATS standard and there's the JATS documentation stuff, which is not part of the standard. The standard doesn't even touch common practices, and the non-normative materials rarely talk about best practice and most often talk about common practice. Which is why I think a group that is identifying best practices is so cool, because it's something different.
Anybody in the back? No. Mirko has his light on.
Mirko Jansi informs. I would refer to this about graphics for math. I would insist one, but high quality. For example, Atipon requires that you have high quality IoT for EPS and everything is processed on the fly, which is nowadays not a big deal. Otherwise, I will be proud that you give you 2 kilobyte full display math that can do nothing with it. And so you should better aim for something better and don't have different versions. Software can handle it in split second at display time.
Are you talking about the graphic element?
Yeah,
is that right? So you're
the
saying,
graphic part.
So you're saying the graphic should be in
EPS?
IoT for, saying example as Atipon does, but certainly not JPEG, even though JPEG can be high quality, but most authors are proud that they compressed it to a very small file. And we here in this room know well what it means. It's typically useless if you need sharp. Let the rendering engine do that.
Can I comment on?
Chris, rescue me.
I think I have two comments. One, I don't think there's any way that we could validate that. That's kind of a quality check that has to be done by a human. At least I can't think of one off the top of my head.
What do you mean, the format?
The resolution of the image. Oh, format, yes, you could, but...
Right, well, Mirko is saying EPS or maybe SVG, vector.
Okay. The other comment is that our focus is really on machine readability. And what you're talking about, I think, is human readability. You want higher quality for humans, whereas machines can't do much with an image, whether it's high resolution or not. So we really didn't focus on that kind of thing. That's why we require that math, ML, or tech
And
be included for
also,
machine
just to add that, we don't want to set the bar so high that no one's going to do this, like, conform to recommendations. So it's a slight kind of tricky line there. Because I don't know whether some hosts might not allow that, and there are certain things that have to be done in certain ways for various places. And so if we made it too difficult, then it might not fly.
My personal preference is not to have any GIF at all, right? No images at all, unless the case is where there is no other way. And as you say, on the fly, these can be generated, but that's that's the way, we do things. But
Debbie LePere again, sorry. I would like to go back and stress something Tommy just pointed out in another way. JATS doesn't talk about best practices much. It really can't. JATS is, at its heart, an interchange format. I should be able to do it in the way that works for me. Tommy should be able to do it in the way that works for her. Kevin does it differently, Wendell does it differently, and we come together to call it JATS. That's exactly why your organization is so important. If there's going to converge around common best practice, somebody else has got to say it, because there's no such thing from the JATS point of view. So that's why your organization is so very important.
John.
Todd Carpenter with NISO. Kind of riffing on this point, I think you guys are doing fantastic work, and I applaud all of your efforts. NISO also has different types of consensus documents in addition to standards that are normative. We also publish recommended practices as well. For example, there's the Open URL standard, and then there are a variety of projects that NISO has undertaken either by itself or in conjunction with other parties to standardize best practice around Open URL, such as the IOTA project or KBART, which are not standards in and of themselves. They're how best to apply the Open URL standard. So similarly, NISO could conceivably adopt some of your recommendations and your recommended practices and incorporate them as non-normative best practices for the community. That's also another option within NISO's structure. Not that I want to overlay any complexity to what you're already doing. As I said, I think it's great work. But I do think that there is a need, an important need, for this infrastructure that goes around a standard about how best to apply it, to kind of put a circle around the more esoteric uses and applications of a standard. So I applaud your efforts, and there is also a place within NISO for that kind of activity.
Great. Well, it's been a year, but I feel like we're really just getting cranked up. And I think we're also getting into coffee break time.
Yeah.
So if we don't have any more questions, thank you all very much.
Very good. Jeff,